Life keeps getting more expensive. Your taxes go up, your rent goes up, parking tickets definitely going up. But somehow, your roads still suck. Your public schools are cutting programs. And downtown, it feels emptier than it used to. So where is all the money going? How can cities be bringing in more revenue and still acting broke? Because in a lot of US cities, the problem is not just bad management. The problem is the system itself. And once you see how the math actually works, you start to see why so many places feel richer on paper, but worse to live in. Strip away all the complexity, and a city has the same basic problem you do. Money comes in, and money goes out. Right now, in a lot of places, more is going out than coming in. And that gap, that's where the cracks begin. From the outside, it looks confusing. You're paying sales tax, property tax, hotel tax, parking tickets. It feels like cities should be flush with cash. But the old revenue engine that once powered everything is breaking down. What looked like a stable tax base was actually a pattern of behavior, and behavior can change fast. For years, downtown was the financial engine, not just because office towers looked impressive, but because they concentrated money in one place. A single busy business district could support restaurants, transit systems, parking revenue, and some of the most valuable real estate in the entire city. That kind of density made the math work. Now that engine is weaker than it used to be. Remote work changed the pattern. In places like San Francisco and parts of New York, downtown office buildings are still sitting half empty, and that's quietly draining billions in tax revenue. But it's not just that fewer workers are showing up. Even when people do come downtown, many spend less time there or avoid certain areas because of concerns about crime and visible homelessness, which remains one of the biggest reasons foot traffic is still so weak. And a lot of those half-empty buildings are not easy to repurpose. Many are older office towers built for a different era, and rigid zoning rules, building codes, and high conversion costs make it difficult to turn them into housing or mixed-use space quickly. Fewer workers downtown means fewer lunches bought, fewer stores open, less economic activity flowing through the city. At the same time, a lot of middle-class families are leaving. They're moving to cheaper areas, lower tax states, or places where housing actually feels attainable. And when they leave, they take their tax dollars with them. So now you get the same pattern in city after city, rising costs and a revenue base that is smaller, weaker, or less predictable. And that is usually when cities reach for something that looks like a fix, but is not. When you don't make enough money, what do? You borrow. Cities do the exact same thing. They issue bonds, basically loans from investors, and promise to pay that money back later with interest. Now, originally, that wasn't a bad idea. Borrow to build infrastructure, improve services, and invest in the future. That's smart debt. But here's where things change. A lot of cities aren't borrowing to grow anymore. They're borrowing just to keep things running, to fill budget gaps, to cover expenses they can't afford. It's like using a credit card, not for emergencies, but for your weekly groceries. You can do that for a while, and from the outside, nothing looks dramatic. You swipe, things keep moving, nobody panics. But underneath, the pressure builds. Interest payments grow, debt piles up, and suddenly, a huge chunk of your budget isn't going to services. It's going to pay off old debt. This is how cities get caught in a growth trap. New development brings in revenue right away. The big maintenance bills show up later. Charles Marone at Strong Towns has a blunt name for this, a growth Ponzi scheme. The idea is simple. Cities keep betting that future growth will cover today's spending, even when that future growth is nowhere near guaranteed. That idea helps explain why debt becomes so seductive. New growth delivers revenue now, maintenance bills show up later. Politically, that's a very convenient trade. Economically, it can be a trap. And here's the part most people don't see coming. As long as investors trust your city, you can keep borrowing. But the moment they don't, that door slams shut. At that point, debt stops being a bridge and starts becoming a weight. Which brings us to the biggest weight of all, the bills cities owe, not for concrete and steel, but for promises they made years ago. If you ask most people what bankrupts a city, they picture something obvious: empty office towers, rising crime, maybe some flashy project that burned through taxpayer money. But some of the biggest costs are much harder to see. They come from promises made years ago and never fully funded. Pensions are the clearest example. City workers, teachers, police officers, firefighters, sanitation crews are promised retirement benefits that can stretch 20, 30, even 40 years into the future. There is nothing unusual about that. The problem is that many governments made those promises without setting aside enough money to fully pay for them. So the cost did not disappear. It was pushed into the future, and now the future is here. It is like putting off a major bill for years, assuming future income will cover it, and then the bill comes due when the budget is already stretched. That is what pensions have become for many governments. And the number is not small. Unfunded public pension liabilities are estimated at roughly $1.3 trillion. That helps explain why people feel like nothing gets better even while they are paying more to live in the same place. A growing share of the budget is already locked in, leaving less room for roads, schools, parks, transit, or public safety. That is why this feels so frustrating to regular residents. They are paying today's prices, but much of the budget is already tied up before any visible improvement even begins. And that leads to the bigger problem. What happens when cities are carrying all of those old obligations while the economy they were built around is changing underneath them? A lot of US cities were built on a bet that paid off for a very long time. The bet was simple. More people would move in, more businesses would open, downtown would stay dominant, and future growth would keep covering today's costs. That assumption shaped everything: zoning, infrastructure, and long-term financial planning. The problem is that this model no longer feels secure. Work moved online, people became more flexible about where they live, and once those habits changed, the system cities were built around started to wobble. Because cities are still paying to maintain a physical system designed for a version of growth that no longer reliably exists. Roads, bridges, pipes, transit stations, parking structures, public buildings, all of it still has to be maintained, whether the old growth pattern holds or not. And that cost is enormous. So now you get cities carrying the cost structure of a boomtown without the growth that once made it affordable. It's like owning a giant house that made sense when your income was high and now struggling just to keep the lights on. And here's the question more people should be asking. If your city were built today from scratch, would it look anything like it does now? Because if the answer is no, then the financial stress you're seeing is not just a rough patch. It is what happens when yesterday's city is trying to survive in today's economy. By now, the impact probably feels pretty personal. You see it in your rent, your commute, your taxes, your schools, and the basic quality of daily life. You pay more, wait longer, and get less back. And yes, cities really can go broke. Detroit did. But most cities do not collapse all at once. They just get a little more expensive, a little less reliable, and a little more frustrating year after year. So what actually fixes that? First, cities have to stop overpromising. If they cannot afford to maintain a road, a rail line, a public building, or a public service for the long haul, they need to stop pretending every new expansion is sustainable. Second, fix the basics before chasing the next big ribbon cutting. Repair the roads people already drive on. Replace the water lines already failing. Maintain the sidewalks, parks, stations, and public spaces people use every day. Third, stop approving growth that makes the math worse. If a new development adds more roads, more pipes, more parking, and more long-term maintenance without bringing in enough value to pay for it, that is not real growth. It is just a bigger bill later. And in a lot of downtowns, cities need to face reality. The old office-heavy model is not coming back the way it was. Empty buildings need to become something useful. Housing, mixed-use space, or neighborhoods people actually live in after work hours. If zoning rules and parking mandates are blocking that, then those rules need to change. Because most residents are not asking for miracles. They want the basics to work. They want a city that feels cleaner, safer, more functional, and worth the price of living there. And that is really the point. Cities do not just need more money, they need a model that gives people more value than frustration. So when city leaders say, "We just don't have the money," what they usually mean is something much bigger than a temporary budget problem. It means the old formula is breaking down. That's why this story feels so familiar in city after city. Different politics, different mayors, different skylines, but the same pattern: higher costs, weaker services, and a growing sense that something is off. So maybe the real question isn't just why American cities are going broke. Maybe it's this: which cities are actually willing to change before the math forces them to? And I want to hear from you. What city are you in? And what feels most different from just a few years ago? Is it downtown, housing, public services, taxes, or just the feeling that you're paying more and trusting less? Let me know in the comments. I'm really curious to see which problems show up everywhere and which ones are unique to your city.